So thank you everybody for being here and welcome to the Everything Need to Change public lecture series. This, as I mentioned before, this is organized by the Architecture Climate Action Network Finland and is supported by the Tampere School of Architecture and Tampere University. These are 10 public lectures about the urgent societal transformation that is needed across all sectors of society, including the built environment. We are part of the problem, and therefore we must be part of the solution too. Clearly, as architects and urbanists, we have a local and global responsibility that can no longer deny or ignore. This lecture will focus on turning climate anxiety into climate action. Today, we open the series with 3 relevant speakers, Tom Bennett, Sophie Pesmaker, and Panu Lentu-Boire. And every Thursday until 11 November, we will bring together national and international speakers to discuss a key area for action. For instance, in the next week we will have Indy Johar, Alexi Neubonen, and Panu Lentu-Boire to discuss how urban planning can be radical and transformational. But also in the week after, we will discuss do we really need growth? And we will have a key speaker from Belgium, such as Maurice Hermans and Christine Grisasco from Taltech. So I totally recommend you joining us every Thursday to discuss how we can make things be different and how everything needs to change. But today, to start, and don't bother you more with the presentation, we have Tom Bennett. He's an architect and a Studio Bark University tutor and climate activist with Extinction Rebellion. In April 2019, he was one of over 1,000 people arrested for participating in no-violence civil disobedience. In 2019, he helped to launch the Architects Climate Action Network. So it's over to you, Tom.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, pleasure to be here.
Yes.
Great. Yes, it's not in full screen though. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, so as Raoul mentioned, I'm an architect based in London. I've been involved in climate activism for quite a number of years, really since I was at university. And so yeah, I've just been asked today to really talk about ACAN in the UK, kind of I suppose the story of how it got going and what it's all about. So yeah, without further ado, I'm going to start with the question why. What was the motivation for starting ACAN? And yeah, it's quite interesting when you think about the history of climate science, because it goes back a really long time. So, you know, over 100 years ago, scientists are already speculating that the burning of fossil fuels could potentially alter our weather systems, alter the climate. And, you know, we've seen a number of key milestones in the 50s. Big oil companies were doing a lot of research on this, and really by the 70s, 80s, there's a scientific consensus more or less on this. So we've known for a long time, and yeah, after the Rio summit, the world's governments came together and formed the COP process, which is the Conference of Parties, attempting to reach some sort of international agreement to address this problem. And you can kind of see that as these various COP meetings have happened, the concentration of carbon in the atmosphere has continued to rise on an exponential curve. So not very promising. Yeah, so, and you know, obviously we've seen some pretty terrifying effects of this particularly over the past kind of 2 or 3 years, and a palpable sense that political leaders are not treating equally with the severity of the situation. So in terms of architecture and what's been happening there, there have been groups that have been active on this, for more or less that same period of time that we've had the scientific consensus understanding of the problem. So, going back to the 70s. So, there've been these groups that have been active in architecture for a while, but they haven't had the kind of mainstream cut through that will be needed for a wholesale kind of transformation of society, really. So yeah, so that was the kind of impetus for starting a group like ACAN. And initially we were quite inspired by Extinction Rebellion, or also known as XR. So April 2019 in London, XR really almost came out of nowhere, and really put the climate emergency on the media agenda, on the political agenda, and did that in quite an effective way that it's really almost unprecedented on this issue. So yeah, a few of us started having meetings over that summer, thinking about, could we have a group that takes some learnings from XR, but brings that kind of activist approach into the profession, into our industry. And we were kind of galvanized a bit by the climate strike that happened around this time 2 years ago, when a lot of architects took the day off work and went to the Building Centre in London to make their voices heard in the streets on the need for urgent action on this issue. So ACAN launched that autumn shortly after, and we held an architects assembly, which is a kind of participatory way of discussing a particular issue. So that was also at the Building Centre, and we had maybe 200 or 300 people come and participate. And really from that point onwards, we started having these open meetings, and yeah, the rest is history. So I suppose in terms of what ACAN actually is, to kind of come to the point, it's a network of individuals. So within architecture, within the construction industry, taking action on the twin crisis, so climate and also biodiversity crisis. So that in a nutshell is what it is. And the emphasis is really on individuals. So this is where, maybe ACAN is a little bit different to, say, Architects Declare or some of these other industry bodies, in that it's grassroots and it's just individuals. It's not a membership organization, so it just relies on participation. But really our mission, or what we're trying to achieve as a group, is to kind of catalyze this transformation that we know is needed. So yeah, it's already been mentioned that the construction industry, the built environment is a big part of the problem. So, we have a particular kind of responsibility and agency, I suppose, to deal with that. So during that summer, we had a lot of discussions about what the group would be and, what we were trying to do. And ultimately where we came to were these kind of 3 high-level aims, things that we're seeking to achieve. So the first is very rapid decarbonisation. So we're sort of dissatisfied with these kind of science fiction kind of futuristic targets that governments are setting. And our attitude is that actually we need to decarbonise as rapidly as possible. So that's kind of the first aim, if you will. The second one is around ecological regeneration. So thinking about how we mitigate the biodiversity crisis. And then the third aim is really underpinning those 2, perhaps. So we see this crisis and the other crises that we're going to face in this epoch known as the Anthropocene. They're really a symptom of a culture that's fundamentally sick and needs to be yeah, it needs to be transformed. We need to grow and evolve as a civilization and a species, and learn to strike some sort of balance with the other systems and species that we cohabit this planet with. We also have 9 values that set out our stall in terms of what type of group we want to be. So a lot of these are taken from other activist groups. So for example, XR, you know, and these kind of groups that come before, we've borrowed quite heavily from the way that they've organized and the kind of principles that they've put forward and attempted to hold themselves to. So yeah, if you're interested to unpack this a bit more, there's a page on our website that gives a slightly longer kind of explanation of all of these. So yeah, those are the values. Really, the kind of theory of change of ACAN is similar to that of a union, in that, you know, collectively, if we're organized, we can find strength in numbers, and we can defeat some of these larger forces that are stacked against change. So yeah, as mentioned, we work in quite a participatory way. Again, that's kind of very much inspired by other activist groups that have come before us. So yeah, that's some stuff about the DNA or constitution of the group, I suppose. Just before I finish, I'm going to talk very briefly, give you a very brief whistle-stop tour of some of the things that have happened in the 2 years that we've been operating. So yeah, we subscribe to this idea of like a diversity of tactics, right? So, you know, some people are keen on protest, other people are keen on, you know, lobbying and writing reports. And I guess our attitude is that we need all of these tools, and different situations will require a slightly different kind of tactic or strategy. So, you know, these are some of the things that we're doing and intending to do. So yeah, events has been absolutely key to the functioning of the group. Obviously in the pandemic, that's all moved online. We've also been creating resources. So if you check out our YouTube channel, that has recordings of many previous kind of meetings, and yeah, some great speakers on a range of topics. So such as our recent circular economy series, which is very popular across the sector. We've infiltrated the institutions a little bit. So we've stood a couple of candidates for RIBA Council, which is kind of one of the bodies that kind of regulates the profession in a sense, along with the ARB. So we've also done a number of stunts and actions, and responded to various government consultations. So often for these, we'll come up with a kind of template that sort of makes it a bit easier for a wider group of people who are probably very time starved, probably have very little discretionary time, sort of trying to enable those people to engage with these sorts of processes. Yeah, our education campaign has been very big here in the UK. So we've had meetings with many heads of schools, and we've also run a series of workshops, or rather the education group has kind of led on that. Yeah, outreach, attending various events, supporting other initiatives. So something that has come out of XR is a bill that is currently being put to the Parliament in the UK, the Climate and Ecological Emergency Bill. So ACAN has been vocal about supporting that, and this was a kind of banner drop kind of social media stunt that we did. Yeah, engagement with the press and the media has been important in terms of like raising the profile, and obviously of course social media. So yeah, in terms of where we're at, we're now 9 thematic groups who are looking at different aspects of the picture. So everything from education to natural materials to, you know, existing buildings, this is a sort of diagram of our structure. So we have coordinators who specialize in various aspects of running the organization, and then we have the thematic groups and various support groups. Yeah, so ongoing campaigns around regulating embodied carbon. So interestingly, another industry group recently kind of picked up on this proposal that we tabled and went ahead and wrote this this bit of policy. So I think we've put some ideas out there that are really gaining traction. Yeah, events very much ongoing. And the other thing that's been quite successful is uptake amongst yeah, students at universities. So we now have apparently 24 groups in different universities dotted around the UK. And our most recent kind of initiative campaign is called Households Declare. So yeah, this is something that's come out of our existing buildings group and is encouraging every household in the UK to declare a climate emergency and to lobby the government for upgrades to the existing housing stock and a national programme to support that. So yeah, that's it from me. That's just a few things that we've been doing, that are some of which are ongoing, and yeah, I hope that's given you a sense of what ACAN is. Very happy to answer any questions later on. So I think I'm handing back to Raoul. Oh, you're muted, Raoul.
Sorry, yes, Tom, thank you for being here today in the kickoff of this 10 public lecture series. And also thank you for all that work you have been doing, no? Moving forward with this network and encourage people, no, to involve, no, in this action. But now, without more delay, I'm going to introduce our next speaker, Sophie Persmaker. She's an environmental architect, educator, and currently associate professor in sustainable architecture and housing design at Tampere University in Finland. She's also author of the Environmental Design Pocketbook 2015, co-authored an Energy People Buildings Architecture for a Changing World in 2021, and guest editor of Everything Needs to Change, Architecture and Climate Emergency in 2021. She has dedicated the last 20 years to bringing the information gap between research and knowledge application in design and architectural practice and education, bringing experiences from Digma and the UK, and now doing a great job here in Tampere. So please, Sophie, over to you.
Thank you. I think you can see the slides now and you can hear me okay?
Yes, perfectly.
Yeah, fantastic. Now, I only finished my slides very late yesterday. I haven't had the chance to run through them. So can you, 10 minutes before time's up, let me know so I don't suddenly run out of time, because normally I do a quick time check. But hi, everyone. And I'm actually quite nervous. There's 122 people here right now. Yeah, so I better pay attention to how I speak. I also briefly wanted to say that while it's recorded, our plan is also to put the videos up and share them. But because of accessibility laws, we might only be able to do that for 2 weeks, but we'll try to see if we can provide subtitles and then we can leave it up for longer as well, but just so you know. So welcome everyone, and thank you so much, Tom, for giving this ACAN background. I'm actually an ACAN Finland member now, and I obviously know a lot about my, about the colleagues and the work that they do in ACAN UK as well. And I'm briefly going to talk about why everything needs to change. And Tom has already touched on a few of those things. So as Raoul said, I'm an environmental architect. I'm originally from Belgium and I lived in the UK about half my life. And I bring experience from the UK and then also from Denmark. And I've been in Finland exactly 2 years now. And as Raoul also said, I dedicated the past 20 years to sustainable architecture. And until 10 years ago, I was a traditional project architect in one of the large, Levi Bernstein Architects, one of the large housing design practices in the UK. And here you can see some of the publications that we've recently published, but then also one coming out in 2022, which is a guide for architecture students designing for the climate emergency. So what I want to cover is very briefly rush through why everything needs to change and the sort of background, and then why it's also about more than CO2. And then I want to actually perhaps cover 5 different points of how design can actually create change. And I want to then sort of cover very briefly through urban infrastructure and some examples, physical infrastructures, energy, organizational infrastructures, and social infrastructures. And then I'll hand over back to the other people. So why everything needs to change? Well, first of all, it's very real. We've just had the IPCC, which stands for the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, release their 6th report, and they issued a code red. Now, that's because the code red is because climate change is widespread, it's rapid, it's intensifying, and also several trends are actually irreversible. For example, the melting of the ice caps, sea level rise as a result of that as well. And of course, also when we then have species that are affected and are going extinct, that's also something that's irreversible. But at the same time, the message was also still very clear that there's still time to limit further climate change, but we really have to act now. And I think that message was very clear from Tom as well. Oops, for some reason, slides are not moving. Oh, okay. The next reason also why everything needs to change is because it's here and even in Finland. So climate change is already with us. For example, in Finland, we have already seen up to today a 2.4 degrees Celsius rise compared to the industrial age. And globally, we're actually already at 1.2 degrees Celsius. And remember, we're actually trying to contain global warming to 1.5 degrees C. So we're not far off. The reason why with Finland is because the Arctic and also around the equator, but particularly the Arctic, is actually differently affected. So the global warming effect isn't even across the whole world. And so particularly in summer, there's an expected rise of 3 to 4 degrees Celsius by the end of the decade, and as much as 8 degrees in winter. And we've already seen in some seasons 5 to 6 degrees already in winter. I'm having some trouble. I wonder if this is my end. When I click, nothing happens. Okay, let's see if my, yeah. So in Finland, not just warming is an issue, but it's also a combination of changes. So for example, we've got also in Finland an issue with sea level rise in the south, but because we also still have from the glacial time, the retreat of the heavy snow and the ice caps in Finland, also that way it is still slightly moving the country up. So actually Finland isn't, and the Nordic region isn't massively affected by the rising sea levels because the land is still slowly going up as also sea levels rise. So they offset each other a little bit. But of course, in the southern region and around the archipelago, that's where we will actually have territorial loss, even in Finland as well. We also are facing superstorms, same in other areas in Europe, and it will increase and also raise the water level. So even as the water level raises, it also then increases the risk for flooding. And of course, also if we have these superstorms, we also can get local flash floods inland. And in summer, we're seeing increased rainfall, but also more sunshine and heat waves. We've just had one of the warmest, I think if it wasn't the warmest and longest heat wave ever recorded in Finland, which was June and July 2021. And despite all this, actually the biggest impact is expected in winter, particularly less snow overall, but then more snow in a shorter period of time. And then there's also mental health impacts associated with this. Now, I read about these things before I moved to Finland, and the first winter I was here, there was very little snow. And people then told me, oh, but once there's snow, it makes such a difference. And then last year we had 30 centimeters of snow in Tampere. And I could really see what people meant, that there could be a mental health impact when there's reduced snow cover. And that's, of course, because the snow really reflects the street lights, any lights from the buildings, but also the little daylight that there is and makes the day so much brighter and prettier. So, there's also going to be these knock-on impacts and other crises that could come out of the climate crisis as well. And that's very specific in different countries as well. And of course, we're already seeing increased rainfall faster than expected as well. And all of this has got impacts on nature and ecosystems and the built environment. For those of you in Finland, I really recommend that you look at Kerttu Kotakorpi's, she's got a new book out, but also she's got some newspaper articles, and she really writes about the Finland situation as well. Unfortunately, she was on holiday, so we couldn't actually get her in this week. And so what are some of the built environment consequences? Well, obviously, if there's summer heat waves, it affects human health. Also increases mortality rate, especially for the elderly and vulnerable, and even in Finland. And that's just because a lot of our buildings aren't really designed, and often people don't know really what to do. So I think it was in 2018, there was around about 300 excess deaths in Finland alone. And in Europe, there was several thousands from the heat wave. And so, as I said, we have these well-insulated homes because we have the cold winters, but often we don't have solar protection. And that means that then you have a lot of sunlight coming in, and then the homes get too hot in heat waves. These are also issues that are actually observed in Germany and in the UK as well. And so then as a result, people might either be uncomfortable, their health suffers, or if they can afford it, they might install air conditioning, which then further exacerbates climate change and then heat subsidies further as well. Other consequences when we have wind-driven rain, which in Finland isn't at the moment a huge problem, but if that happens and it keeps a facade wet for longer, and it's not designed for that, and of course, also internally, more humid climate increases moisture problems. It can lead to mold growth, transfer of damp coming into the inside, that then also affects human health and well-being. The other thing is also when we have these extreme temperature cycles, so when we have very fast sort of freezing and thaw cycles, not only actually when you have ice on the roof, so it starts creating, when it melts, it creates ice, it's heavier, and that then creates structural potential issues, but also it really affects actually the construction and building life cycle with these fast temperature swings. And so Kerttu Kotakorpi said we should stop underestimating the problem, and doing nothing is most worrying. And so she was really pulling at the alarm bell as well here in Finland. And so it's clearly urgent. And so it's basically real, it's already happening, it's with us, and it's urgent. The IPCC said that unless there are immediate, rapid and large-scale reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, limiting warming to 1.5 degrees C will be beyond reach. And you can see actually this map on the right, you know, sort of where we're aiming for at 1.5 degrees, but that as the impacts, basically, as we have these increased temperatures, then we actually get these larger impacts and more severe impacts as well. And of course, more irreversible impacts, specifically in our lifetime. So it's really important that while we sort of have to accept that we're already in climate change, that we still limit this as well. The other thing is, of course, is at scale. We have to really act at scale. I mean, Finland has announced they want to be carbon neutral by 2035. As Tom was saying, in a way, these far away kind of deadlines don't make a huge amount of sense, because then we don't do anything and we think we still have plenty of time. We have to really cut now. Of course, 2035 is actually now only 14 years away, and every single country, continent needs to actually move towards this carbon neutral society, and it's across all aspects of society that are impacted. As you probably have seen these numbers before, 36% of carbon emissions in the EU are associated with the built environment, and countries cannot be carbon neutral without also the built environment urgently transforming. I've shown this graph before, my apologies for those of you who've seen it, but basically this is sort of showing how we really need this change now. Well, ideally yesterday and 20, 30 years ago, we should have done more. And what it shows you is that sort of the global temperature increase that you can see here up till sort of now, and that we can still actually determine now. We still have that moment to determine on what trajectory we'll be at. At the moment, we are actually hitting at the end of the century high to medium high global warming, and that means somewhere up to between 3 to 5 degrees Celsius rise. And we're obviously trying to keep it below this 1.5 to 2 degrees maximum, and that's really actually because that's the estimate that then the West Antarctic and Greenland ice sheets would not be melting, because when they do, that will give us 3 to 7 meters sea level rise, affecting huge amounts of people in coastal regions, and yeah, it's really severe. So this is what we're really trying to do, that we're trying to stay below this 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius, and we just have basically no real time to act. We have to really do things now, not in the future anymore. And as I said at the start, if we already have global warming of 1.2 degrees Celsius in the last 100 or so years, there's only 0.3 degree difference between that warming, and this was in 2020, to not hit our ideal maximum of 1.5 degrees. So we really have to act now. And that's because we can still shape the future as well. And then one other really important reason why everything needs to change is that we have, and I should say global, not global, responsibility. So we have this global responsibility, each of us as individual citizens, but also as architects, because the decisions we make, whether it's material specification, whether we're going to demolish or build something from new, how much energy that will be needed by people to use the building, all of that actually affects people and other species thousands of miles away. So the impact we have from decisions in Europe, in Finland, in the UK, and wherever you're calling from, actually has an impact to other people. And particularly, what is really important to realize is that a lot of low-lying countries, for example, Bangladesh, as you can see here on the map, are actually majorly under threat because they're so low-lying, but they hardly had any cause or contributed to these rising sea levels. And on top of that, they're also ill-prepared to adapt. For example, Bangladesh only accounts for less than 0.35% of global greenhouse gas emissions, yet at the same time, what the actions we do, we might think, well, Finland can adapt, and if it gets a bit warmer, we can manage it. But actually, other countries are really being punished from our actions and really are suffering. Here you can see an example at the moment what the sort of the shoreline is of Bangladesh as well. And 60% of its land surface is only at 5 meters or less above the sea level. So a third of the population of Bangladesh, or 165 million people, are actually at risk of this sea level rise. And that's because they actually, might lose 30% of the land surface in basically the next 30 years. And you can see that here, this projection by, if you have 4 degrees C warming, what that actually would mean for Bangladesh. So it's really a significant issue. So clearly the impacts are severe. And as I said, often those contributing the least are being the most impacted. Another example is Kiribati in the Pacific, that are also one of the first countries that are already, particularly in storms, are going underwater. And so this relates to climate justice issues as well, and hence our global responsibility. So clearly what is needed is rapid, far-reaching and unprecedented changes in all aspects of society. And the EU Environmental Protection Agency has been referring to it as transformational change, and that we can no longer do these small changes that we're seeing and a little bit more sustainable. We actually really need to transform how we think about everyday actions, and also in our profession as well. So how are we going to do that? First of all, the clear priority is that we need to stop burning fossil fuels. What is a bit shocking if you arrive in Finland, for example, in Helsinki, that more than half of Helsinki's heat is produced with coal. Tampere has, I think it's between 20 and 25% for its district heating is peat. And obviously these are, very highly intensive, carbon intensive fuels. So we need to basically stop burning these fuels altogether. There's a lot of plans of how they might transform and transition to these clean fuels. Helsinki did an energy challenge, worldwide kind of competition for ideas to do that. And just today, this top image shows you, actually from yesterday, shows you that scientists were saying that we need to ditch 90% of world's coal, 60% of oil and gas to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And of course, that also includes transportation and so on. And so, of course, that's why we have this focus on energy and carbon. Operational carbon means building energy consumption, which is still the majority of where the energy and carbon emissions are associated. And then we've got embodied carbon, which is 10 to 30% of the building's footprint. Of course, if we're reducing operational carbon proportionally, it will also become more important and will go up. Briefly, embodied carbon is that for the extraction, manufacture, transport, installation of construction materials, but also maintenance, reuse, demolition, end-of-life issues, and so on as well. So Clearly, people use energy in buildings, but also, of course, for materials, and as in for heating, light, ventilation, appliances, and so on. And if we then use fossil fuels like gas, oil, and coal, then we actually end up with this high carbon emission pollution. And that then leads to global warming. It's a problem again, yeah. Leads to global warming, and we need to make sure that people use less energy, and then we make the energy non-fossil fuel source, so clean power source like solar or wind power. And that's why we're referring to this systemic shift or transition in society that's needed. And it's really a whole move away from fossil fuels and unsustainable behaviors. In a sense, we are addicted to fossil fuels because everything we do actually is based on fossil fuels, even a lot of the clothes we wear as well, not only the manufacture, but even the products that it contains. Nearly zero energy buildings are part of that transition, but of course we're also talking about transportation, city life, consumption behaviors, agriculture, manufacturing, and so forth. So it's, as I said, across the whole of society. But what's also really important is if we're really trying to avert the climate crisis, of course it is all about CO2, but it's actually about more than CO2. And I would like to use this quote by Lance Hosey, an architect in the United States, and the author of Shape of Green, which I highly recommend you to read. And he says the following: imagine a day when we've perfectly solved the challenges of energy, resources, and emissions, and everything we do and make is clean, harmless, and infinitely renewable. Is that enough? The point he's making here is that what are we trying to preserve? Why are we trying to preserve our happiness, our way of life? How can we do that, doing that in a clean way? And if we actually are only preserving our subsistence and our just survival, maybe that isn't enough in itself. So that's why it's also about more than CO2. So as we're transitioning to this carbon neutral society, it's really important that we actually also take into account all of the other aspects that matter in life and that gives us, the society that we have as well. And so energy and carbon reductions on their own are not enough. Yet at the moment, that's really what we're focusing on because, of course, it is so utterly important because of this climate crisis that we're facing. But there's other issues. Of course, we need to adapt to climate change, but also we shouldn't forget about daylight and health and well-being impacts from that. Also, of course, the resources and finite resources that we end up using, including also waste that we create and water that we use, not just materials. We've also got social sustainability to consider, ecological sustainability, and of course also biodiversity. And there's many more of these issues. And as I said, most of the time we really focus on the energy and CO2. And while we can prioritize energy and CO2, it's not okay when we then reduce high standards elsewhere. So this is actually not okay when we are at the expense of energy and CO2, then actually neglecting biodiversity or health and well-being. So we need this minimum standard and focus for each aspect, otherwise it's unsustainable overall. We also not only need to think more holistic, but also we need to think more restorative. So it's really about undoing some of the damage that the developments we're currently creating, but also some of the past damage that we are creating. There's also another reason why it's always good to think restorative and to try to create this positive change, because we're also finding that a lot of proposals and buildings that we're building and developments that we undertake don't actually perform the way we expect them to. In reality, they perform worse. So that also means we have some kind of safety margin, but it's also about really offsetting previous damage that we've done. And again, some of my students have seen this before. If you're here, my apologies, but I really can't, emphasize enough that often when we talked in the last 10, 20 years about small changes we would make, and we'd say, oh, let's aim for 10% better or 25% better than the building regulations, and we call it a green building. But actually, if you really start to look at those buildings and study them, what happens is that they're still not, they're more sustainable than others, but they're still an unsustainable design because they usually still have negative environmental and negative social impacts as well. And that's, of course, building regulations are the worst we can get away with. That's what we legally can get away with. And we need to do a lot better than them and strive to a lot better. And so where we have sustainable architecture, we've sort of neutralized and minimized the impacts. But really where we need to go to is to this restorative design where we have positive environmental and social impacts. And we try to, as I said, offset some of the past damage and try to repair and restore. And I've been referring to it as super architecture because we're asking a lot of what we're trying to do here. So super architecture is really design that can support or hinder sustainable behaviors and lifestyles. And I think it's when we realize the power of design that can actually really nudge our behaviors. I think that's also when we actually move from climate anxiety into positive climate action as well. So we need a lot less of this hindering, where we have architecture that might hinder sustainable behaviors and lifestyles, and about being more supportive and more restorative as well. And there's then these opportunities to make influence at different scale. And as I said earlier, it's about this urban, physical, energy, organization, and social infrastructure. And I'll now cover each of these very briefly and give some examples of how we can have at these different scales, how we can have design that can support or hinder sustainable lifestyles. My time is very limited, so the picture I'm giving you is also limited and not complete, but hopefully it gives you some idea of the power of design at these different scales, of how we can actually create restorative design. If I'm pausing and I might look funny, it's because I actually have problems with my own laptop moving the slides around, which is slightly strange. So with regards to urban infrastructure, so good urban infrastructure can positively influence our behavior. Some examples that are obvious is it reduces car reliance through good public transport. We can walk, and good cycle connectivity as well. We can provide opportunities for sharing of spaces, and again, sharing of bikes and car sharing and other kind of facilities as well. We can include other facilities nearby that can be easily reached. And it's also then about designing connectivity to urban green spaces, leisure, and all of that supports well-being as well. If we don't provide it, citizens simply cannot use it. So, we cannot guarantee that when we're trying to nudge people in a certain direction, that they will be nudged that way and they will behave that way. But at least if we provide the opportunity, they at least have the option to take that opportunity. So the nudge architecture principle is really about encouraging citizens to make more sustainable choices and or healthier choices. The projects you see on the right are in Copenhagen, the university. They've got space for 20,000 bikes. It also creates this open space and then actually slightly lifted off, and this bike storage, and also creates this water retention basin, because Copenhagen is also at risk of flash floods already, but also, of course, storm and issues with sea level rise as well. Another example where urban infrastructure can really create change is that it's not just about new urban infrastructure that we create, but also transformation of existing cities. And actually everything we have already is going to be not only our big challenge to transform that, our cities and buildings, but of course also there's inherently often a more sustainable approach to it, because we work with existing resources as well. And Barcelona and the Barcelona superblocks are one example, where they've tried to create these super blocks whereby the motorized transport and the pollution and the noise is moved to the kind of perimeter, and then internally in the spaces are then sort of, it's given over again to people and the community that they can then use for leisure and we'll come back to this, social infrastructure and so on, and greenery as well. So it can encourage more sustainable lifestyles as well, and if it's safer to walk and less noisy, then it actually affects people's health and well-being, and we encourage active lifestyles. So as I said, less resource use, less pollution, and healthier residents as a result. Then we also have this principle of the 15-minute city, because good urban infrastructure can really ensure that we can actually move around by foot or bike really well, and that everything is nearby us. Now, of course, this has been discussed, mixed-use developments, Jane Jacobs' time several decades ago, and now with COVID, a lot of the cities have now been signing up to this 15-minute or 20-minute neighborhood because they realize that actually not having to commute, people that have everything at home, really not only supports ecological aspects and ecological targets, but also actually people's health and well-being. So the idea is that you can basically within 50 minutes walk or cycle from your home, and even if it's then to a transport node that takes you to work as well. It's also the idea that it helps provide social infrastructure. The one danger that there is, of course, with these kind of developments is that when we're trying to emphasize, this often goes together with densification of cities, and also, of course, these hybrid functions. You have a bakery, workshops, you have community spaces, you have health centers, you have homes, you have green spaces, you have mobility connections, and everything very close together, that developers might use this to then overly develop the land for economic gains, but without really then balancing housing with other functions. So the idea is not that this is purely just a high dense housing development, but it has to be combined with these other facilities as well that then are very walkable in that neighborhood. Another aspect of urban infrastructure is that there can be real, there is a significant impact from the urban onto the individual buildings. So if you have a very good urban plan, then it can really affect the actual energy use of the buildings that later then architects have to plug into and design a smaller plot. One example is what I call the development of these urban breaks. And as you can see this diagram on the right, but basically it's about really considerate urban design that then makes it easier for occupants to live sustainably so that it supports the physical infrastructure. And so these urban breaks can create this pleasant microclimate. It reduces urban canyons where you have these major winds coming in. Also can minimize the urban heat island effect because there's enough wind speed to take the kind of hot and polluted air away as well. And it's really about creating differences in story heights and living spaces that can then, or more living spaces that can face south, but they can also have different directions for better daylight, for better connection, and also bringing sunlight into open spaces behind as well. Of course, there's another implication to this, that if we're building with a greater form factor, so less compact building form, we have increased heat loss. So all of these need to be carefully offset as well. I won't go into too much detail on this, but green and blue infrastructures are also very much part, of course, of urban infrastructure. Ideally, they're combined. You can see some images here on the left, which it's sort of trying to show you that we need to look at linking or creating new greenery to really physically link to existing greenery as well, so that we create these biodiversity paths and green bridges. But that's also at these different scales, so that if we do this at the larger scheme, we can then actually also more easily incorporate it in a more restorative way at then the block scale as well. And these continuous green corridors or green bridges are really important because when we're talking about biodiversity, a lot of species cannot actually cross roads, they don't fly. So we're otherwise really genetically isolating them in certain regions. Their food supply, what they predate for their survival is then limited, but also their own genetic pool becomes limited as well. So it's really important that we link these spaces rather than looking at it at a building block scale. And then, of course, more and more, we also have to consider these issues of flood proofing, whether that is then, you can see here actually flood proofing more for sea level rises, which is of course different from flash floods, but it's really important that these two can be combined and should be combined as well. And an example of this is by Guan Jiangyu at Turenscape in China. This is actually, and actually maybe I'll show you this first. So you see at the bottom how that originally a lot of the rivers in China have been really defensively barriered, like also most of Europe is like that. So you have these hard concrete boundaries, very, a little bit of a connection with greenery and so on, but it's very controlled. And what he has been doing is creating these sponge cities whereby both sewage can be treated, it provides leisure, but it's also in a sense bringing back the floodplain, the natural floodplain of the river as well. And it provides leisure at the same time and huge biodiversity haven as well. And as I said, also can treat sewage, the next stage of sewage and so on. So this is sort of this more of this restorative approach that we really should be looking at. But you can also see the scale of that transformation, that it does mean removing all of those concrete barriers, making the all of the river accessible again for other species, also human beings, and really re-landscaping all of this very carefully. As one example.
9 minutes. Okay,
thanks. That brings me to physical infrastructure. And again, I want to give some examples how that can support or hinder sustainable lifestyles. So with good building design, we can support occupants to live sustainably and make it easy for them without having to think about it. And an example I want to use is that by a colleague at UCL. and did a PhD on this. And this graph actually shows you that when you're on the left-hand side, I have no idea if I move the mouse, if you can see me move it, but on the left-hand side, in the blue line, you can see somebody with a low heating behavior in a well-insulated house uses very little energy. And if they're in a badly insulated house, they still don't use a huge amount. But if you have in the same well-insulated building, this is actually housing, in the same well-insulated house, somebody with high heating behavior uses quite a lot more energy than that with a medium or low heating behavior. But when they live in a badly insulated house, that heat demand massively goes up. So the lesson after this is that high fabric efficiency standards are very robust to different user behavior. So it means that if we insulate really well, even if somebody starts heating to 23, 24 degrees inside the house, even then it's massively contained and the carbon emissions will be lower from properties like that compared to when they're very badly insulated. And so we cannot influence people's heating behavior very well. Although there's some kind of, again, nudge architecture that we can do more like apps, but that's also why it's so important that we actually can insulate the buildings really well, because we can influence that and you can see what influence it actually has, that even it allows that bad behavior, if you like, but still the impact is much more reduced than if we didn't provide this physical infrastructure. An example of this, of well-insulated building, is the Passive House standard. It performs very well because it's got this high fabric standard. This project in Germany shows you smaller windows on the north, then balconies as solar shading and bigger windows on the south as well. And the theory is that you only need people to heat a building. Of course, in reality, you still need a small heating system for those few days or weeks, depending where you are in the world, that you still need some top-up heating in winter. And sometimes, actually, in other countries, you need cooling, some active cooling as well in summer. What we need to be careful, of course, is when we are designing, and particularly when we're retrofitting, when we're upgrading existing very badly insulated buildings, to make them better insulated, that they can overheat in summer unless there's solar shading. So we need to make sure that residents can be thermally comfortable. Otherwise, again, it's at risk that they're not comfortable, their health is impacted, or if they can afford it, they could start using, installing air conditioning, using more energy that way. So we really need to do good solar design. Another example is that of shallow dwelling plan. I'm noticing that in Finland especially, but also in other countries and the Nordic region, we're building more and more deep fat housing blocks, and they're very efficient and economic to build, but they actually don't enable sustainable lifestyles, while shallow dwelling plans do. And that's because when we have shallow dwelling plans, we can have good daylight. That means we don't need as much artificial light on, and then it reduces the associated energy use. The other thing is also, if we have more shallow building plans, we can actually have more adaptable plan layouts. You can divide rooms much better because you don't suddenly end up with a space with completely no window ventilation. And of course, that also then supports social infrastructure in the community, because residents can stay when life situations change, so they invest in their community. Also, shallow plans usually have less risk of summertime overheating because it's easier to actually ventilate spaces. And if we then combine these shallow dwelling plans with better connections to outdoor spaces and greenery, then we really can support health and well-being better. And that then also reduces pressure on health infrastructures. An example of this is work done by our wonderful colleague, Sini Sarima. And this is an example of Deep Plan on the right. This is actually an actual proposed project. And you can see on the left here, the dotted line that shows you the city plan and how that the architects literally built almost directly, in one case of the block, less so in the one on the right, they built almost directly to the permissible buildable area. And you get these very deep block plans with a long kind of corridor, only one stair core, and you get mostly single aspect dwellings in this case. And this is actually quite typical of what's happening in Finland. First of all, there's too many units that are too small. 6 of 9 are 1 or 2 room apartments. As I said, they're single aspect, and they're also very deep planned. They're 6 meters or deeper. Sometimes they're 9 or 10 meters deep and only window facing one way. They're also, because of that, then very inadaptable. So Sini ended up studying this in quite some detail. You have a link below. We can share these slides as well. You can read more in that paper. And she ended up redesigning this block to a much slimmer block. There's 3 entry cores, but actually, so it goes from fat to slim. And there's, it removes also this long corridor, and there's much better daylight because of the shape of the dwelling. We also don't always have a balcony. There's also facades. There's almost in all cases double aspect. And it increases adaptability because of that as well. Now, of course, you must be wondering, hang on a minute, how do you fit that long block on the same plot? Well, it does fit. You can see it here. There's actually a constellation of several. So you can still fit the same number of units. You can even face south, but it is going away from this really fat block, and it's, of course, challenging the city plan. So a design, the slim block, is much more sustainable, encourages more sustainable behavior. Yes, there will be a slight energy penalty as well from heat loss, and is one of the things that Raul and colleagues and I are looking at and understanding what are those implications. But as I said, it gives better solar gain, better daylight, better quality living, it's more adaptable, so people will be more invested in the community. And this really highlights this connection between the urban and physical infrastructure and the ability to support or hinder sustainable behaviors and lifestyles. Of course, the critique will be, well, it's going to be more costly. We do need more materials that affects embodied energy. But the question we also have to ask is, what is the cost of not building better? Because there are financial implications also to environmental, social health and well-being cost of unsustainable designs. So, we then, with regards to cost, we basically need to start making a lot of these sustainable decisions very early on. And this graph shows you this, that if you make decisions very late on in the process, it actually becomes very costly. And that also relates back to the challenge we're going to have with regards to embodied carbon. We need to reduce embodied carbon of our materials by minimum 65% in less than a decade. Now, how are we going to achieve that? First of all, we need to stop demolishing, refurbish a lot more. We need to use low impact materials like timber. We need to use reclaimed materials. 50% of materials should be reclaimed that we get from somewhere else, including timber. And 80% of the materials that we are including in our the actual construction should be kept for circulation so that they can actually be reused again. So we need to design for disassembly. But I don't see this change yet happening in architecture at any big scale, because I don't think as architects we realize how we might do this and the importance of actually doing this as well. But clearly it has implications for our design and design process, because we then need to know what materials we use very early on to then adapt our designs to that. So this early decision making is really important. Here's some projects you can see. Lanager Group are some of the ones that have been looking at this, and also the EU headquarters use some of these recycled components as well. Energy infrastructure. Very briefly, careful design of efficient and clean energy infrastructure is needed, but we should also not forget about human factors and things that can go wrong. Very quickly, this is the Strata Tower in London. I've never seen it turn. I might ask Tom if he's since seen it turn since I left. The reason is that actually it was quite expensive, but also makes noise and vibration. It was switched off overnight and actually it never produced electricity. And it's likely that it might even have created more embodied carbon than it actually ever gained. And that's because these kind of technologies, even at high level, at story level, doesn't really work because we have too inconsistent wind speeds in cities. So we also need to be very careful as architects. It's good to do blue sky thinking, but let's also get real. We need to save carbon emissions for real, not just on paper. I'm getting to the end of the talk. Organizational infrastructure is also really important and something we often don't get involved with as architects, but estate and also city management can really support and enhance our lifestyles or hinder it. For example, we can make it easy or difficult to recycle, depending on the collection points and times. We can make it easy to grow food and compost if appropriate facilities are provided. And then at a building scale, we can also make it easy to look after new technologies or difficult. So for example, ventilation, filter cleaning, and so on. And so what's really key is that we involve stakeholders before and after, we work closely with them, that we understand and act on what they want and need. And that also doesn't just mean the end user who will live or work in the space, but also facilities managers as well. We need to make sure we've got easy to use controls, and as you can see here on the right, also user manuals for occupants that are really easy to see and not 30 pages of a difficult to read document. And of course, every time that we have new tenants, we also need to really recommission the system and perhaps run them through how things work as well. And so this is all about undertaking post-occupancy evaluation and building performance evaluation. An example of how some of this evaluation and monitoring has revealed some interesting issues, which is discussed in more detail in a book that I co-authored with Judith Kimpian and Hattie Hartman, is Loxford School by AHR Architects. And very quickly on this project, this is a courtyard for the children to play, and there is a main lobby area, but also fire escape. And if you had to go from one end of the building, it was easier rather than walk around the perimeter inside the building in good weather, or when it wasn't raining, it's easier to just cross the courtyard and take the fire escape to go in. But what the nobody realized was that nobody had a key to the fire escape, so it was always locked, and then people put it open, you know, put a wedge in between. As a result, there was a lot of heat loss. People were always cold inside in that lobby space. The actual renewable energy heat pump or low energy heat pump couldn't actually meet the heat demand. So the backup boilers that were fossil fuel would push in. And so as a result, the carbon emissions weren't achieved, and all of that because actually just a lock. Now that was only revealed because they noticed that actually the backup boiler was always kicking in. They could then find out what were the reasons behind it and realized is that one fire door that was kept open, and it was a very simple kind of hatch that could be changed so that it could actually be open and closed. And that's only we know this because of going back to the building and monitoring it and finding out what were the problems and why it did not work as expected. So EcoViki, similar issues, even in Helsinki when we've actually got very few studies, but also there we're finding that some of the energy use is not actually quite as expected. It's sometimes a little bit better, but often worse. And is then going back and understanding and learning for basically our next kind of projects as well. Of course, it's not just about, again, carbon emissions and energy use, but also about indoor air quality, indoor environmental quality, and how people feel about these spaces. And that brings me then to really the final larger kind of infrastructure I wanted to cover, perhaps one of the more important ones as well, about social infrastructure. And social infrastructure is really spaces and places that support community encounters. So it's, for example, lively pedestrian environment, well-maintained parks, the bench, local commercial services, community spaces. So it's about this infrastructure that supports residents where they can meet, whether it's planned to meet or also just meet a diversity of people, otherwise they wouldn't come across. And you can see a project in Paris actually that is very much a social infrastructure designed with and for and built with the local community by AAA. And so then when we have that infrastructure, it encourages people to get together, they can support each other, it reduces isolation, and it's particularly important for older people and those that live alone. And Eric Klinenberg has done seminal work in this already several decades ago now, I think, or 20 years ago. And he showed that it can actually save lives, particularly in a Chicago heat wave, when people could look after each other when they were part of a community. And so the built environment characteristics are really of considerable importance to human health and well-being. Some examples here are a wide enough walkway so that people can pass each other but can also sit and linger. Some other kind of disused spaces that can actually provide the social infrastructure, and benches that are designed for people to sit on, but perhaps even to sleep on for homeless people, rather than what we've been seeing more, this defensive and aggressive architecture with spikes and slanted benches, so people cannot spend any long time on it as well. So one project I briefly wanted to show, not much time to go through, is in Malawi, this maternity village, and it's effectively where women go to wait before they go to the hospital. And that's because they actually live quite far away from the hospital before they give birth. And then there is actually huge health and well-being issues and puts the child at risk as well. And so there's now 36 rooms, and a lot what the architects focused on was actually the social infrastructure, that women just wanted to be there while they're waiting to give birth. They wanted to be there to just talk and spend time. And so the roof is very important because it protects from the sun, but also from the rain. And so a lot of these spaces are actually just about lingering seating areas, a connected kind of roof space that you can see here for actually the community to be. There's then also some guest rooms that also family and friends can come and visit as well. And they also use local materials and unfired brick wood and so on as well. So this really enhances the social infrastructure for both the women here, but also the whole community. And it's actually so popular, they now need, they don't have enough rooms. So yeah. And so that then leads us to health infrastructure, that all of this, what I described, has an impact on sustainable lifestyles, actually can really reduce the pressure on health infrastructure. We've just recently seen this with COVID, that there's been evidence of increased COVID-19 infection and death reported in the US, the UK, and Singapore because of people living in poor quality housing and overcrowded conditions. I haven't seen the link in Finland yet, but in Finland, there's actually, I've seen the latest statistics, I think it's not quite 20%, it's 16% of people live in overcrowded conditions, even in Finland. So good in health and well-being is, of course, not just the absence of disease, but it's also then about these social justice issues and an equitable carbon neutral transition as well that we have to be pay so much attention to as well. And of course, any inequalities exacerbate health impacts in society, and you can hopefully have seen some aspects of designs can support or hinder that as well. So in summary, we're part of the solution. And we can no longer do business as usual. No more of these small changes, no more of being a little bit more sustainable. We really need to significantly shift. And a lot of the things that I'm showing are projects that do certain things really well, but we need all of these projects to do all of those things really well. And so we can and must change our current way of doing things across all layers of society. And for us as architects and urbanists and other people in the built environment, it means we have to change how we design spaces and places. I also think it means that we need to decenter ourselves. That means not designing for our own portfolio or for how we as peers judge our architecture, and that we need to center other people and other communities and the other non-humans first. That doesn't mean that I'm arguing against beautiful architecture. I think these two very well go together, but it is actually about really what drives our designs at the heart is different as a starting point. And of course, our architecture must not be permitted to transgress others' rights, whether they're human or non-human. And I know that this might seem overwhelming, but I think it's not a time for climate anxiety, but for one to be optimistic and to put our creative skills to good use and create a better world and planet. And I hope that I've shown some of the ways that we can do this and that we can put our own design skills to good use. So this is why we have this lecture series, and we're going to unfold many more of these issues and discuss them in more depth as well, in particular topics as well. So please join us and be part of the change. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sophie, for this inspiring talk, thought-provoking talk. And now we go to we will have time for discussion afterwards, so that we keep on with the schedule, and you can please ask questions in the chat. I am keeping them to find them later, and then I will integrate them into the discussion. But now we move to Panu's talk. Panu Lehtovuori, if you can maybe turn on your camera. And Panu is professor of planning theory at Tampere University in the School of Architecture. Before this current position, he was a professor of urban studies at the Estonia Academy of Arts in Tallinn. And his research is based on critical urban theory, and his interests focus on public urban space, temporary uses, and other contemporary forms of urban agency, conceptual design, approaches, and transformative view of the sustainability of the built environment. And I definitely think it's a very interesting aspect, this critical urban theory, and I'm very eager to listen more to this. He is also a partner at Spin Unit, an international, you must tell me what this is, R&D initiative for radical urban transformation, and also at Nordic Urbanism, a startup in continued professional education. And he is permanent expert in the renewal process of the Land Use and Building Act. So Panu, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Dalia, and big applause to Sophie. Very, very thorough and interesting talk. I try to keep my talk quite short now. I will continue next week. We are having interesting set on continuing the question of what planning can do and how to rethink planning. But as I said, I keep now short so that we have time to discuss and bit shape even our series and the forthcoming 9 talks. Sorry, let me share my screen. Good. Is it working?
Yes.
Fine. So very bold title, new agenda for urban planning. Basically, when I was thinking how to approach this this talk and how to make something fresh for a quite big international audience, I went back to my childhood, and I remember that I was probably 12 years old. We were picking berries in the summer cottage of my my godmother, likely 1980. And I remember that in forest, I was explaining the greenhouse effect, kasvuhuoneilmiö in Finnish, to her. And I remember that because she didn't want to listen. Somehow she was not happy to hear that. And I guess it's because, well, for example, she didn't want change. She had orange beetle. We were so poor that we didn't have a car in our family. So, for example, once we went to France, I was maybe 5 years old with my godfather and mother. And so she was a very close person to me. But really, I had this memory that she didn't want to listen. And when Tom was starting today, and you mentioned them already, very, very long history from 1960s and even before of knowing the issue of greenhouse effect, of climate change, of climate emergency, as we call it now. I started to have the same thought as you. How is it possible that now, 40 years later for me, this is coming as a new issue? We are witnessing some kind of global and cross-generational self-deception. There is something quite strange. Why is this? Is it because of some politicians? Is it because of big companies? Probably, yes. I think we should see some kind of judgment of all the dictators, elected presidents, company heads, asset owners, and so forth, who have used such a long time their resources to slow the change and also manipulate opinion and decision making. I think so-called big tobacco is quite small if you compare to the fossil fuel lobby globally. And it's still active. We are not seeing a so quick change as we should. I think this has been said with different words already many times today, but it really is quite alarming. For example, just to make it local, Finland has been supporting this Nord Stream project, which basically is a new set of gas pipelines from Russia to Germany. It's very, very big investment, only to increase greenhouse emissions, not to reduce them. It's happening now in front of our eyes in the sea, in Baltic Sea. Clearly, it's complex, it's global, it's deeply imbued in political economy, in how politics, global, international, national, local politics are intertwined with economy, with making our environment, including the built environment. We are also in the era of so-called planetary urbanization. It's a concept from Christian Schmid and Neil Brenner. And I think the Nord Stream is a quite good example. We are networked technically in many ways. And I think the notion of Anthropocene is probably quite correct. Stephen Graham in Newcastle is at the moment working on the notion of cities being geological, because at the moment we are, as humankind, we are moving more material than the natural processes of Earth. It's quite amazing to think that all the issues of mountains being raised because of the crust of Earth, big rivers moving sand, sea currents moving material, that's at the moment smaller than human processes that touch the crust of Earth. We are dealing with a very, very big and complex topic. Focusing on this small country, North Finland, this the most recent statistics of carbon emission I could find. The graphics are a bit awkward, sorry for that. But basically, the black line is the total net emissions of Finland. So on the kind of emission side, there is one element which is the part of carbon emissions that are in the global emission trading system, and then there is the other part which is not in that global system that puts a price to carbon emissions. In Finland last year, the emission trading was about 20 million tons of CO2 equivalent. There is a quite complex system to calculate other gases so that it matches CO2. And this non-traded so-called effort sharing was almost 30 million tons of CO2 equivalent. Land uses, basically forests and wetlands, they are a big carbon sink in Finland because there is so much forest. So Finland is having more than 20 million ton of carbon sinks. Last year, in average of last about 20 years, it has been a bit less, about 16 million tons CO2 equivalent annually. It kind of looks good because the emissions are going down, but they're not going down fast enough. And especially it's quite worrying that what is going down is exactly this carbon trade part. It's the big industry and energy companies who are forced with this trading scheme to change their practices to save money. And a very big part of that positive development is because of that. Cities, what Sophie was telling about, heating, transport, the embodied carbon in buildings, and also agriculture. That is changing very, very slowly. There are EU regulations that are linked to the Kyoto Protocol. So it is going down a bit, but it's really, really very slow in my opinion. As said, forests are sequestering carbon in Finland, but the positive impact of that is changing a lot year by year, and that's linked to the forest industry, basically how much trees are felled to make pulp and paper to the global market. With that, I would like to start with a very, very simple thought experiment. As Tom was saying, globally, things are going quite badly. For example, Amazon Basin already is now a carbon source, not a carbon sink as it used to be. Reason, political and economic decisions that favor intensive forestry, animal grazing, and soybeans farming in Brazil. And I think quite likely here in Europe, we have to compensate, for example, that loss and other global problems by changing the way we manage our forests. This is something for Sweden, Finland, but also Russia, Canada, these countries with big surfaces and a lot of forest. We have to change. That's the thought experiment. What it could mean for Finland. Here, very, very simplified graphic from now to 2035. If we would double the carbon sink of the forestry sector, our problem would be solved. You see the black arrow. It would mean that forest would eat between 45 to 50 megatons CO2 annually. And this would be possible by roughly halving the annual felling of trees for pulp and paper. And as we know, trees are the best way to sequester carbon. There's a link to one story in New York Times, which is going through that in quite interesting way. So this seems on this kind of paper quite possible. What it would mean in practice? It will be very good for biodiversity and the experience qualities of forests. At the moment, the average age when a tree is felled in Finland is 70 years, and Finland is full of these terrible views of killed forests at the moment, even though the image of Finnish forestry is quite good. The reality is a bit different. This thought experiment of halving, reducing by 50% the felling would mean that in average, a tree would live for 140 years. And it's still quite short life for a tree, because a pine can grow 400, 500 years in this Nordic climate and really grow. It would sequester carbon every year, 500 years. It would be very, very good and sensible idea, in fact, from ecological and social point of view. Economically, of course, about half of pulp and paper factories should close. That would mean about 2% loss of gross national production for Finland, and bigger loss for the export, because forestry is having about 12% of export for Finland at the moment. It would mean about zero growth for a certain transition period. Is this possible? Is this big thing or small thing? I leave that for all of us to think, but I think it shows a bit the scale of change for this kind of country that is maybe having quite good position and quite good resources to fight climate change. It would mean a complete radical transformation of forestry sector. It would kill many companies. It would be bad for many small towns. It would change the livelihood of people working from forest. But it would be possible, and it would have very many good effects as well. Okay, yes, there really is something having the same as Sophie, a bit difficulty to move the slides. So this thought experiment might solve Finland, but how about other places? It is a global issue. As Sophie said, we do need changes in every sector of society, including cities, construction, and urban life. And when I started to think this question of new agenda, it was quite difficult, I would say. Planning, we have these historic examples from past decades, planning for industrial growth, reshaping especially the industrial society, putting public resources in roads, social housing, and so forth. I will tell next week more about the societal role of planning and how that is changing, how that might change. But in short, for this introduction, we are moving to what Henri Lefebvre calls the urban society. It's not industrial anymore. It's qualitatively a different way to organize our common life. And how to plan for that? It's a question mark. At the same time, obviously, it's this change is unfolding under these multiple crises we are dealing: climate, biodiversity, but also crises in democracy, why there is so much right-wing populism, crises in trust in government. Kate Raworth has condensed that situation, I think, quite well in this donut diagram. We have an ecological ceiling, and we need to take care of the social foundation. We have quite a narrow space to operate, to reach this regenerative way to run our society. Sophie was so well describing. First, to a bit add to what Sophie said, I've been thinking a lot that can we design out climate change? There is almost consensus in planning circles that if you look back 150 years, about 100 years, many diseases, for example, cholera, was designed out because of better sewage systems, because of sanitation, drinking water, more air to housing, a bit lower densities in working class housing, and so forth. So this whole project of modern urban planning has been also a sanitary project, and design, urban design, building design, technical design has been an important part of that. There is a success story. This is a question to me, but I just took, I'm now in Moscow, so greetings from this great city. And there's a recent quite interesting article, you can see them link to it, that's claiming Moscow being the greenest city in the world. It sounds completely crazy. We have imagination, Moscow being dense, dirty, Russian, gray industries and so forth. And this is simply not true. In less than 20 years, they have been planting more than 1 million trees, and it really is visible. These views that are now from the article, I can witness that from my own window. Moscow has become green, and it also historically has had some very interesting green assets, but there is a very, very massive regreening program. And I think it's on the scale that it influences. It influences the experiential quality. There are beautiful parks and yards everywhere, literally everywhere. It does improve acoustics. It does improve the quality of air, and it has some impact on the carbon footprint of the city. Of course, there is limit. It's 12 million people. These issues cannot be solved locally only, but it has some issue. There is potential in design, and I think Sophie's very, very good and detailed examples tell a lot about that. There is very much we can do. I think physical planning ideas on sustainability, it's great, but it's not enough. Here is Wolf Daseking, who became famous by the very long time planner of Freiburg in southern Germany, Freiburg being a model city of green urbanism. Wolf had this kind of list, which is very close to what we heard from Sophie earlier. Compact city of short paths, a very, very careful integration of urban structure and public transport, certain typological and morphological variation so that the built structure supports social mix. There are cheap and expensive places. There are rough and polished places close with each other. It's also what Jane Jacobs said in 1961, the famous book of Death and Life of Great American Cities. Clearly, integration of work, public spaces and private services so that you don't need to travel so much. You have everything close by. And then preservation of valuable natural areas and good access to forest and beaches. Makes sense. Very, very sensible, sensible ideas. Peter Hall, Sir Peter Hall, died a couple of years ago with massively long career in planning thinking. Already in late 1990s, he had this kind of list of things to do, having many quite small settlements that cluster, and they form a larger settlement from less than 1 million, of course, in some cases, to bigger scale. Again, mixed land use patterns, so that there is employment and commercial opportunities dispersed and close to everybody. Opportunities clustered locally, so that there is walking, biking distance works well. And then we had some ideas based on certain geographical analyses on the optimal density on the, let's say, lot or neighborhood scale. Good ideas, but not enough. So what more should we have? What is then the additional element in the planning agenda for future sustainability? When looking at history, when looking at Peter Hall, modernist planning and so forth, you can say that history planning is actually a story of economic theories that are interpreted, that are put in practice as normative spatial ideas. Garden city, modernist approaches, and so forth. This is quite clear, in fact. And if this is true, I think we need fundamentally new social, including economic thinking, to find new planning ideas. So it should come from rethinking society, rethinking politics, rethinking how we are together as humankind. And that way we can get to the new agenda. I hope that in this lecture series we can develop ideas and start to kind of fill the gaps of this thinking. But something that opened that a bit to me is Adriana Allen, who already a while ago wrote this kind of quite simple and clear definition of sustainability of the built environment. She's saying that it's about interventions. It's not about something very holistic, but it's an intervention. It's something concrete we do that increase the livability of buildings and urban infrastructure for everybody. So it's inclusive. And it does that without damaging the nature and ecological values that are around. It also should somehow concern the economic dimension. It's still quite broad. It's very open definition, but from that, I think it's kind of 1 and 2: enhance livability and do that so that also nature is winning. Nature, which is the actor without voice in these human processes. And any project should do that. So in that sense, it's about rethinking the planning project. This was just a thematic in one conference yesterday and today. There's a UK-Ireland planning conference happening right now, and they have this title, Rethinking the Planning Project. Any project should make urban spaces more socially inclusive, attractive, acceptable, inspiring, and make sure that nature gets something more. It's about regeneration in that sense. How to do that? I wish that we can develop many more ideas, but clearly very important to me is revaluing and protecting public good. We have seen a long time of very profit-driven neoliberal urban development. In some countries less, in some countries more, but clearly this public dimension, public good, common good. What are we gaining together? What is shared in city, and what is adding, let's say, value, adding quality of life, making every life better? We should revalue and find ways, local, regional ways to protect that from, let's say, economic exploitation. We should be open for new. We should nurture innovation, social, spatial, organizational, innovation. This is something very maybe difficult, but also interesting, because if you look again back in history, about 100 years ago, we started to realize the value of parks. So parks, it was not just unbuilt land, but it became understood as very important space, lungs of the city in the sense of air quality, but obviously also social spaces, gathering, mental health. All these aspects were realized very clearly 100 years ago, or even more than 100 years ago. And parks, even though they don't produce direct profit, that became part of the planning agenda. Much later, from 70s on, historic buildings were also revalued. There was a heritage movement and preservation of buildings, again, same way, became part of the planning agenda. Now we should find a way, in the same way, to bring social and spatial innovation, new ideas, new ways to organize our life together as part of the agenda. We should look at the margins, not only at the big cities and city centers. Very often there is new opportunities happening in distant places where there is less economic pressure and maybe less control. We should question all categories of thinking. A case very close to me is this distinction between private and public. I'm interested in public space, in streets, parks, but is there something which is not falling in these two categories? Yes, there is commons. What urban commons could mean today? I think that's an example of interesting question. Do things in different way and create hope. I think that's very important for the new agenda for urban planning. We are having tough situation. We are facing crisis. It feels overwhelming. There is too much to do and too little time. But I think creating hope is very important for ourselves, but especially for our children. Only if we can motivate people, only if we can get also the new generation motivated to, let's say, strive for a better world, we can win. Good.
Just very few more minutes. Yeah.
One more point. Exactly. This is my last slide, in fact. One more point, and this is almost reiterating what Sophie was saying, but here's a diagram from a project we did a while ago about holistic resource efficiency of a built environment. Clearly, we can make changes in physical infrastructure. It's the lower right corner, or we can make changes in people's values and behavior. And so there is the hard and soft infrastructure and let's say value dimension of change. And obviously best is to find hybrids. And I think this is one way to think how we can act in this dynamic situation. Instead of static normative rules, we should be flexible, agile, and able to act in the dynamic, all the time changing situation of urban change. Multiscalar, digital realm, understanding the processes as continuous learning, being open to experiments, and so forth. There is a whole set of dimensions of this hybridity and experimentation. Good. I finish with 2-3 pictures from a very recent experiment that I think gives one example of what this new agenda could be. It's an event called CESAM 2021, Poliklinika. It happened in a small town called Slavitych in Ukraine, a town that was built to replace Chernobyl, to replace the city around the nuclear power plant that exploded in 1986. And the town called Pripyat, of course, had to be emptied. So this Slavitych is a 1980s project to create new housing for all the workers and their families that lost everything in this catastrophe. And now it's shrinking, it's quite empty. And students led by German Mitisch, who is also working in our university in Tampere, they organized a quite long event to invite students from all over the world and make a change in that small town, to reimagine the empty spaces, to engage citizens, to make some kind of new planning project, completely newly defined planning project. They did something in the forest, they did something in the interiors. And I think this project shows that there is light at the end of this tunnel. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Panu. And yeah, I would like to invite Tom, maybe Raul as well. Well, Sophie has already. Do you want to announce this quickly, Panu?
Okay, yeah, maybe before we go to discussion. So just next week we are having Indy Johar, the founder of Dark Matter Labs, very interesting thinker of deep cutting transformations. What means this dark matter? We'll hear about that next week. And Aleksi Neuvonen from Demos Helsinki will tell about transformation planning in the era of existential uncertainty. I will wrap and I will a bit develop more my story of today, pin it a bit down to be more concrete, and then we have hopefully good discussion. We are having whole 3 hours, so we start 4 o'clock Finnish time 2 o'clock UK time next week.
Okay, I would like to invite anybody to comment or ask any questions before Raul and I ask some questions. But yeah, anybody? I know that there were some in the chat. I have them written down, but I would invite you to speak up. Okay, no. Then I will start with one question. It was posed by Debbie, who has been very active in our chat. And I guess it's for both, I guess. So is it enough to design usual spaces with greener materials and heating? Or what about other kinds of spaces, of shared facilities, or spaces that have shared facilities? And can architects help in rebuilding the non-consumerist identity at a certain scale? Sophie, go for it.
Yeah, I mean, I obviously in such a short space and in itself could be one talk, right? Absolutely. I mean, this is also what I mean, and thanks Debbie for asking that question, because ultimately when we talk about transformation, and this is what bothers me a bit, it's about we built the same, we just add a solar panel to it. It feels a bit like business as usual, and we just consume other stuff to make up for it and offset what we do. So I do think it's very much part of rethinking what more can we share? How can we live differently? What does that mean? For who would that suit or not? And actually a lot of our students, and I responded in the chat, but it's getting, you can't seem to respond directly to a point, unfortunately. Yes, I do think a lot of our students, and also in research, we're investigating that. And I think also your work, Dalia, is very related to that, right? It's sharing of urban spaces, community spaces, but then also homes and offices. And we're even looking at sort of hybrid buildings whereby instead of that you end up creating housing within a community room, a washroom. Could it be so that actually residents use the community space from an office meeting room that's empty at night, for example, so that we don't need to create loads of extra infrastructure and extra spaces, but there can be much more sharing. So it doesn't even have to be in the block, but even within the city and at the neighborhood scale. But it does feel that our work should have been done yesterday. And I always feel like we're behind on actually then what needs to happen because it's so slow how everything happens. And that's, of course, the other important thing we didn't really talk about, but whatever we do today, you know, we cannot afford to get it wrong because we have to fix so many other things. And, you know, the longevity of what we're designing is in place for such a long period of time, all these infrastructures. There's a huge risk that whatever we do now has to be what Banu said, it's about being flexible and agile as well, so they can be adjusted and change over time and accommodate other uses or spaces that change or people that use them in different ways and take over. So I do think it's a fundamental shift, but we then have these, and the whole chat was full with it, quite powerful market forces. Yeah, I'll leave it there. I fully agree with the comment.
Yeah, just a quick comment. Of course, we as architects, we have and we can have very many roles. We can act through media. We can show example with non-profit projects. We can do research. There are many ways to influence. But there's interesting discussion here right now. Finland is creating new architectural policy. It's let's say in the process of getting finalized, and there is debate about changing the role of architects in projects, and it's maybe a bit wishful thinking, but in the spirit of everything needs to change, I think it's true, it should change. And if there is a broad acceptance, or maybe even with legal support, I think architects could take a role that is really integrative, exactly as you, Sophie, said. I mean, rethinking projects so that for example, every house in city is not having every services, but there is possibility to kind of link and find ways to persuade actors to change their rules, for example, and so forth. It and could be.
Yeah, and some of it already happens here in Finland, which, I mean, it's interesting because, for example, we have a compost bin, but it has to meet certain city criteria, or you can have an eco compost bin and a normal waste collected. And actually each house doesn't need to have it on their own. So we teamed up with 5 neighbors And we have metal and plastic recycling with 4, and then eco bin and normal bin with 5. And, you know, it means we actually have to cross the road. We don't have our own bin, but it's actually things like that at a much bigger scale. And not only, and the other thing is, of course, is not only the new spaces, but also existing. How do we change an existing infrastructure? That's going to be our biggest challenge, actually, not only in the buildings, but also in the cities. And then there's issues of ownership, who owns which part that you use, and how do you, of course, now we can use digital apps are very helpful of booking rooms and seeing availability and getting access to spaces. I think that's the way forward in a way, but we also have to make sure we don't exclude people when we do that. When I'm terrible using apps and stuff that, oh, I can't use a space because I don't have a smartphone or the latest version. And, you know, there's also all of these ethical issues associated with it, but I think it is really thinking big in that way. And at the moment, we're still looking very much at the plot because of the way ownership works. And maybe I would like to hear also from Tom, but Mario put a message out, which I thought was very interesting, this question of how is it so that one building plot owner can do vast, like decide to demolish, and they make that decision despite the ecological impact long term, but even the immediate disruption, and that's considered okay? Like, how is that possible that one person can kind of have that impact and there's no other measures in place and no other evaluation, it seems, not the community has no say over it.
Yeah, I mean, just to come in on that, I suppose, I think that's massive, isn't it? Like, what do we do with all the existing buildings that we have that are not fit for the situation we're in and that we're heading to? So, you know, in the UK, I think 80% of the houses that we have in 2050 will be the houses that we already have. So, you know, yeah, successive governments have completely failed to even really, to really do anything about this. So that's a massive challenge, and, you know, links to what ACAN's trying to do with households declare. But yeah, at the same time, yeah, I think that's just a huge issue that we're going to have to grapple with. And, you know, perhaps part of this whole situation is just seeing how can we do more, do things differently with what we already have, and be a little bit less carte blanche about the way we kind of plan things and do things.
Could I ask a question back to you, Tom, as well? And Vapano asked, designing out climate change, do you think is it possible? And is there anyone else who wants to comment on that?
I think you can design in a way that, yeah, obviously through biogenic materials, for example, you can design a building that sequesters carbon. But, you know, yeah, there's then questions about lifespan and what happens to that building at the end of its life, and what ultimately happens to all the carbon that's locked up in those materials at the end of its life. So, yeah, obviously in terms of carbon impacts, like some buildings have a massive carbon impact and some buildings, you know, have a much smaller impact. So there's clearly something we can do, but I think as well, I think there's something slightly problematic about thinking about it in terms of, you know, individual architects. How do you make the right decisions on a project? Because, you know, architects are often not the most powerful people in the situation. So there's a certain amount that you can do that obviously you should do and use your agency. But yeah, at the same time, just increasingly, I think we've got to transform the whole way that society operates. And in terms of the built environment, we really need to level up those minimum requirements, you know, those building regulations, to account for some of these things that you've been talking about in your presentations, because else it's going to remain quite niche. It will be architects who care and clients who are enlightened, but you know, we need to kind of mainstream this stuff, and it needs to be happening across the board. So in that sense, we're talking about transformation at a societal level, you know, in politics, in economics, in policy, in regulation, all of that kind of stuff, I think is, yeah, what we need to target to get that change.
Anybody want to comment or yes, Edward, please.
Hi everyone. Great presentation, Sophie. Great presentation, everybody. Actually, I mean, this is all subject that I've been sort of mulling over for the best part of 15 years now. I think the real problem is that we live in an industry that actually we're creating assets, tradable assets that end up on the stock exchange in some sense or another. And we're finding difficulty in decoupling all of that from what we really know needs to happen, which is to build buildings that actually can have some sort of hope of being not just saving the planet, but being restorative. And buildings very much have that capability. Now, I don't believe that clients necessarily, who are the other side of the coin from the people who make the money, on the building, I don't think clients want developers, using our skills to profit themselves. So somehow we need to restore that connection back to clients, to show value back to clients, that we can have their interests at heart, that we can actually get them buildings that not just are more sustainable, but actually are healthy, that are actually better for them, that actually can be part of their growth stack for their own businesses moving forward, and to do something that actually makes a much stronger connection, and to have rationales and narratives that create that connection between what architects and designers do in buildings and how that can help to inform a better future for the people and the business who actually begin to inherit that business, that building, and take it on into the future. So all of this then predicates that we have to think about things slightly differently. And I think we need to actually get closer to our users. And we need to start designing buildings from the bottom up and not from the C-suite down. So we need to start to think about who the users are, what they're doing, how they want to use a building, how they're going to use the building. And of course, all of this is really necessary as well. If we are actually going to have buildings that are zero and zero at the meter, we really do need to know how they're going to be used. And we need to have a much firmer connection with those people who are actually going to use them. So which is why in my kind of sphere, I've been promoting the use and development of just different ways of creating briefs, and creating the brief, developing briefs that are much more user-centric, and trying to get to clients who actually will allow us to get, absolutely and much more granular with them as clients, rather than just dealing with the C-suite. So I think that to me is part of the solution. So, I mean, I think we all know how to design buildings. We all know how to, well, I take it it's a given we all know how to design zero carbon. Maybe there's a little bit of education there as well. But ultimately, I think it's more about thinking about the thinking that we're not doing. And that is to actually just approach the thing from a different way, to the way that we're actually always been doing it up to now. So that's my thoughts on it.
Thank you very much. Katja has also a question, and maybe then we can follow up to Edward's comment.
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me?
Hi, Katja.
Yes.
Hello, Sophie. Actually, following Edward's comments, I just had a kind of a creative idea that I would like to propose maybe to everyone. We are expecting, for instance, investors to change their lifestyle and the way they work, and maybe officials to change how they design cities, and actually for other people to change their core personality. But if we think what is a radical decision, it would be maybe not to build anything like for 10 years or 15 years. And that would make a big impact on each of us, if we decided, okay, we are not building anymore, we're just not doing this work, we're on climate strike for 15 years, that will decide a bit of problems in construction if they do not get a professional to design the project. But we're not doing this. Why? Because that's who we are. We are doing buildings, and largely the way they are now. So I think starting thinking from yourself, how could I change myself? I do not know the answer actually. Maybe finding a new job, but how we could do it as an industry, that's kind of interesting thing. I would like some ideas on that. Yes, exactly. Don't build less, build wisely. I personally, I moved from new construction to renovation just the other year. But what's the next step?
Join ACAN.
Sure.
Because I do think, I mean, also Panu was saying this, right? It's about the, you know, the young, the future architects or current architects are in practice making a difference. And I get a sense that quite a lot of our students suffer from climate anxiety because they hear all this bad news, but I don't feel they have the skills to really act. And sort of Edward is really got all of these years of experience working in industry, seeing the issues, but then students don't have that perspective. Like Edward can see where it's come from, what needs to happen, but then he's sort of very slow in how it happens. And I think students need that. But I do think in that sense, ACAN, whether it's ACAN proper or ACAN students, is really helpful, because then actually you feel you're doing something and you're learning and you're with other people. And it is about people using action to create that change rather than having that anxiety. But Tom, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I was just going to comment on that. I think, I think it's a provocative thought, and there is actually a campaign to end construction. I don't know if anyone's seen that. I suppose that's the radical end of the spectrum. But, I think there is a lot for us to do in terms of retrofit. In terms of new build, obviously a building can, or a project, shall we say, like the urban design project that Sophie showed, like they can have a restorative kind of regenerative impact. So it can be beneficial to do projects in that sense. And Kate Rayworth, who was mentioned earlier, she talks a lot about Interface Carpets as a business and what they've done working with Janine Benyes, who's like a biomimicry expert, seeing how actually building their factory can offer more ecological benefit than if they didn't build it. So yeah, I think there's a lot of nuance around this. So yeah, I think we can build regeneratively. We've got a lot of work to do to adapt the built environment that we've got, both in terms of reducing energy and then adapting to a changing climate. But, beyond our work as architects, as Sophie said, we need to think about how we link up and have a collective voice and actually, change things at a system level. Because, my personal view is that it's fine to be making individual decisions and doing individual projects, but I think we need to couple that with finding a way to influence the system as a whole. So yeah, sorry, I feel like I went off on one then, so I'll shut up now.
I was going to say, I was actually typing it in, that in Belgium they have a beton stop, which actually means a concrete stop, not because of ecological reasons, but because they've run out of land. It's such a small country, and the way they've been building is super sprawl, and all of these detached houses. And so it actually means that they will have to look at the existing much more carefully. But of course, what it also creates is that the plots that you can still build on are massively overinflated. And it means that then the rich can still pollute and build new. But yeah, this is an interesting thing. I don't think we all have the answers. And of course, I've now removed myself from actual practice. And it also then remains difficult to you know, sort of between theory and practice. I think Pano is more closely still with practice related and being able to experiment more. But of course, we are experimenting with students and what are the next steps. But I think as a collective, we can do a lot. So yeah, and I think Robert, hi Robert, if you wanted to ask your question, we sort of run out of time, but you talk about if the architect disengages, do you think there won't be new buildings? Because of course, a lot of us are actually not involved even in many buildings as architects as well. And the other thing I think, and this is where we're excited of working together with Pano and EKAN to bring all of this together, is that we're crossing the scales of regional planning, city, and then, you know, the urban and the building, because often what we know most about is the building scale, but actually the influence of one on the other is really massive. And I think is that dialogue and the scale we work at is really super important, and I think is often missing actually. Sort of talks cross both, well, 3 of the scales at least. So yeah.
I think the regional dimension is quite important. Well, my example of Finland was quite speculative, of course, but yeah, maybe like the idea of stopping building completely, it's kind of idea of radical cut to some type of economic activity. But it's already a long time ago, I think more than 10 years ago, I was discussing with some a bit advanced sustainable people in the Netherlands. And for example, in the north of Netherlands, there is this combination of still some natural gas left, of course, sea, wind. So there's a whole set of local or regional resources, and it became quite obvious that you can find a unique solution if you combine in a clever way regionally resources. I think it's one dimension, this multi-scalar approach.
Well, yeah, go ahead.
No, I was thinking that we are 5 minutes over the time, and we can somehow now wrap up. Encourage our people not to join us next week for the next session. Also, I'm now putting